He thought the safe house was the one place nothing could go wrong, but something inside it was already breaking in silence. Emily Carter's hands trembled as she dragged the cloth across the polished marble floor. The faint scent of antiseptic mixing with the cold, expensive stillness of the room. Her movements careful, precise, as if one wrong motion might shatter something fragile that no one else could see. The overhead lights casting a soft glow that reflected off the surface beneath her, revealing nothing but perfection to anyone who walked in. And yet her breath came uneven, catching in her chest, as though the air itself had grown heavier, harder to hold. She paused for just a second, her fingers tightening around the cloth, her shoulders rising as she tried to steady herself. But the sound slipped out anyway, a quiet, broken inhale that echoed louder than it should have in a place designed for silence. She pressed her lips together quickly, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to appear to reprimand her, to remind her that even the smallest crack in composure, was not allowed. Because here, in this house tucked away behind layers of security and anonymity, perfection wasn't just expected, it was enforced, and Emily had learned that lesson faster than most. Just 3 weeks ago, she had arrived with nothing but a small suitcase and a promise of steady pay, a chance to start over in a city that never seemed to notice people like her unless they made a mistake, and she had promised herself she wouldn't. She would keep her head down, do the job, stay invisible the way she always had, the way she always needed to be, because invisibility meant survival, meant safety, meant no one asked questions she couldn't answer. But something had changed, something she couldn't quite name, something that made the quiet feel heavier, the shadows longer, the hours stretch in ways that didn't make sense. She had noticed it first in the little things, the way certain hallways were suddenly off limits at odd hours, the way conversations stopped the second she entered a room, the way the cameras, always present, always watching, seemed to go dark for just a few minutes at a time, minutes no one ever explained, and she told herself it wasn't her place to wonder, wasn't her place. To think beyond the next task, the next room, the next surface that needed to shine. But tonight it was harder. Tonight the silence pressed in around her until it felt like it might swallow her whole. And when the sound came again, that small, helpless hitch in her breath, she couldn't stop it, her eyes stinging as she lowered her head, letting a single tear fall before she could catch it, disappearing into the spotless floor as if it had never been there, as if she had never been there. And somewhere beyond the locked doors and guarded gates, a car slowed to a stop, its engine cutting through the stillness for just a moment before fading away, unnoticed by the one person who mattered most, because Emily was too focused on holding herself together, on making sure that when the door finally opened, when footsteps inevitably crossed that threshold, there would be no trace left of the crack she couldn't afford to show, no evidence that something inside this perfect, untouchable place had already begun to fall apart. The door opened without a sound, the kind of quiet precision that only came from someone who expected control in every detail. And Kang Jimin stepped inside, as if the space itself belonged to him, his presence filling the room not with noise, but with weight, the faint scent of cold night air trailing behind him as he closed the door with a soft click, his eyes adjusting instantly, scanning the layout with practiced ease. Every surface exactly as it should be, every line clean, every object in place, and yet something felt wrong, not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed out or measured, but in the way the silence sat heavier than usual, like a room holding its breath. He took a slow step forward, the polished floor reflecting his figure in sharp detail, tailored dark coat, controlled posture, a man who moved like nothing could touch him. And still, his gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary, as if he were listening for something beneath the quiet. And then he heard it, not loud, not obvious, just a faint shift in the air, a breath that did not belong to the empty stillness. His eyes narrowed slightly, turning toward the kitchen corridor where the lights softened and shadows gathered in the corners. And there she was, Emily Carter, kneeling by the floor with her back partially turned, her movements frozen for half a second. A moment, she realized she was no longer alone, her hands still clutching the cloth, her shoulders stiffening as if bracing for something she could not see, and then she moved quickly, almost too quickly, wiping at her face before rising to her feet, her head lowering immediately, posture folding inward in a way that spoke of habit. Not choice. I am sorry, sir, the words came out, steady but quiet, as if rehearsed, as if apology was the safest language she knew. Jamin did not respond right away, his gaze resting on her not with anger, not even with curiosity, but with something far more unsettling, attention, the kind that noticed details others ignored, the faint redness in her eyes, the way her breathing had not quite steadied, the small tremor in her fingers that she tried to hide by tightening her grip on the cloth. And for a moment the room held that silence. Between them, thick and unmoving. You are working late, he said finally, his voice low. Even, revealing nothing, Emily nodded quickly without looking up. Yes, sir, just finishing the floors. I'll be done soon. She shifted slightly, as if to step away, to remove herself from his line of sight, but he did not move, and that stillness forced her to remain where she was, caught in the quiet weight of his presence. His eyes drifted past her for just a second, taking in the surrounding space, the flawless surface she had been cleaning, the faint streak that had already disappeared, and then something else, something out of place not in the room but in the pattern, a subtle inconsistency that did not belong. You missed a spot, he said, though his tone carried no accusation, only observation. Emily blinked, startled, her eyes flicking up for just a fraction of a second before dropping again. I will take care of it right away, sir. She moved quickly, stepping back to the exact area he indicated, though the floor looked no different than the rest. Her movements precise, almost urgent, as if correcting even an invisible mistake mattered more than anything else. Jamin watched without speaking, his expression unchanged, but something behind his eyes shifted, something quiet and calculating, because it was not the missed spot that caught his attention. It was the way she reacted to it, the way fear seemed to move faster than logic. And, as he turned slightly, his gaze flickering toward the hallway cameras that should have been active, always active, he noticed the faintest delay in the indicator light, a blink that came a fraction too late, and in that small, nearly imperceptible detail, the silence of the safe house no longer felt like control. It felt like something was being hidden. The indicator light blinked again, just a fraction too late, and Kong Jae-min did not look at it directly. Not at first, because men like him did not react to uncertainty with haste. They absorbed it, measured it, let it settle into something they could control, but the delay was there, small enough that most would miss it, subtle enough to be dismissed as nothing, and yet in a place designed to operate without error. Nothing was never just nothing. His gaze returned to Emily, who was still, kneeling now, wiping the same section of floor with a precision that bordered on desperation, her movements repeating, slower this time, more careful, as if perfection could erase whatever had been seen before he walked in. You can stop, he said quietly, and she froze again, her hand hovering just above the marble, unsure whether stopping would be another mistake. I'm almost finished, sir, she replied, her voice controlled but thinner than before, and he noticed that too, the way she held herself, not like someone completing a task, but like someone waiting for permission to exist. His eyes lingered on her wrist as she adjusted her grip on the cloth, the sleeve of her uniform shifting just enough to reveal a faint discoloration beneath the fabric. Not obvious, not dramatic, but wrong in a way that did not belong in a place like this. His expression did not change, but something inside him sharpened. The kind of awareness that had kept him alive in rooms far more dangerous than this one. Who else is on shift tonight? He asked, his tone still even, still unreadable. Emily hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any answer. Just the night supervisor and 2 staff members, sir, she said finally, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jamin nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, but his mind was already moving ahead, mapping patterns, recalling reports, schedules, security logs that should have aligned perfectly, and yet did not. The camera delay, the restricted corridors, the tension in her voice, they were not separate details. They were pieces of the same fracture. He turned slightly, his footsteps quiet against the polished surface as he moved toward the hallway. Emily's breath catching for just a second as he passed. As if his movement alone shifted the air around her, he stopped near the corner where the camera was mounted, his eyes lifting briefly to the small device, its red indicator steady now, flawless, obedient, as if it had never faltered at all. But he had seen it, and more importantly, he had felt it, the moment when control slipped, when something unseen moved beneath the surface. Behind him, Emily resumed cleaning, though slower now, more measured, as if every motion was being weighed against something invisible, something she could not afford to reveal. Jamin glanced back once, just enough to catch the way her shoulders tensed at the sound of his movement, the way she seemed to brace without knowing why. And that was when it became clear this was not about a mistake, not about a missed spot on a floor or a delayed camera signal. This was about fear, not the loud kind that demanded attention, but the quiet kind that reshaped behavior, that taught people to shrink, to anticipate consequences before they were spoken. He stepped into the hallway, the lighting cooler here, shadows stretching longer along the walls. And as he walked, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with a casual motion that revealed nothing of intent, his thumb moving across the screen once, initiating a silent check that would not alert anyone but him. The system responded instantly, data flowing as expected, schedules, access logs, everything in perfect order, too perfect, because perfection without explanation was its own kind of flaw. He stopped at the end of the corridor, his reflection faint in the glass panel beside him. And for a moment, he stood completely still, listening not to sound, but to absence, the kind that told him something had been removed, altered, concealed, and somewhere behind him, in a room designed to be invisible. Emily Carter lowered her head again, her hand steady now only because she had learned how to hide the tremor, not because it was gone. And Kang Jae-min, without turning back, understood one thing with absolute clarity: whatever was happening inside this safe house, it was not random, and it was not small. The system showed nothing out of place. And that was the first real problem, because Kang Jae-min had built his operations on one unbreakable principle, that flaws revealed themselves in patterns, and patterns never lied. Yet here everything aligned too cleanly. Schedules matched, access logs were complete, every entry accounted for down to the second. And still, the feeling remained, that quiet disruption beneath the surface, like a perfectly still lake hiding a current too strong to see. He lowered the phone slowly, his reflection in the glass panel staring back at him with the same controlled stillness. But his eyes were sharper now, more focused, because he had learned long ago that the most dangerous inconsistencies were not the obvious ones. They were the ones that had been corrected, adjusted, erased so carefully that only a trace of unnatural precision remained. He turned and walked back down the hallway, his steps measured, unhurried, as if nothing had changed, as if he had already dismissed whatever instinct had stirred inside him. And yet his attention widened, taking in everything: the faint hum of the ventilation system, the temperature of the air, the way the lights held steady without flicker. And when he reached the main room again, Emily was no longer kneeling. She stood near the counter now, hands clasped lightly in front of her, posture straight but guarded, as if she had placed herself in a position that required no explanation. Her eyes lowered, avoiding his gaze without appearing to avoid it, a balance that spoke of practice, not comfort. "You are finished," he said, not as a question but an observation. "Yes, sir," she replied softly, her voice steadier than before, but not by much. Jamin studied her for a moment, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to notice what had shifted. The floor was spotless, the room unchanged, and yet she had moved herself away from the center, closer to the edges, closer to the exit, as if distance itself offered some form of protection. "You should rest," he said, his tone neutral, giving nothing away. Emily hesitated again. That same brief pause that had become familiar. "I still have tasks to complete, sir," she answered, and this time her voice carried something else beneath it. Something restrained, something careful, as if the wrong answer might lead somewhere she did not want to go. Jamin nodded once, accepting the response without challenge. But his gaze shifted past her, toward the far end of a room where a secondary hallway led to the staff quarters. The door there was closed, as expected, but the light beneath it was not. A faint glow outlining the frame in a way that suggested recent movement, not current presence. He glanced back at Emily. Her shoulders had tightened almost imperceptibly, her hands clasping a little more firmly. And in that moment, the connection formed, not a conclusion, not yet, but a direction, the kind that guided action without announcing it. He moved toward the hallway without another word, his presence passing her like a shadow, silent and controlled. And she did not stop him, did not speak, but the air shifted again, that same tension tightening as he approached the closed door, his hand pausing just short of the handle. Not because he hesitated, but because he listened, not for sound, but for absence, and behind him, Emily's breath caught once more, softer this time, almost silent, as if she had already learned that even the smallest sound could matter. Jaemin's fingers rested lightly against the door, feeling the faint warmth of the wood, a detail that should not have been there in an empty room, and in that subtle contradiction, the silence of the safe house fractured just enough to confirm what he already suspected. Something inside this place was being hidden not from the outside world, but from him, and that minute had been happening long enough for someone to believe he would never notice. The door did not open immediately, and that was intentional, because Kang Jaemin never rushed a moment that could reveal more by waiting, his fingers resting lightly against the handle as he let the silence stretch, measuring it, weighing it, feeling the faint warmth beneath his palm that should not have been there if the room beyond had truly been empty. And behind him, the air tightened again, not with movement, but with awareness. Emily standing just out of his direct line of sight, her presence quiet yet unmistakable, as if the space itself had learned to shift around. Her tension, "You can go," he said without turning, his voice calm, almost casual, but it carried an authority that did not require emphasis. There was a pause, longer this time, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. "Yes, sir." Her footsteps were nearly silent as she moved away, each step careful, controlled, as if she were trying not to disturb something fragile. And when the faint sound of her movement disappeared into the distance, the house settled again into that unnatural stillness. Jaemin waited another second, then pressed the handle down slowly, the door opening with a quiet ease that revealed nothing at first, just a dimly lit room, orderly, undisturbed, exactly as it should be. And yet the warmth remained, lingering in the air like a trace that refused to fade. His eyes adjusted quickly, scanning every detail with precision, the bed neatly made, the desk cleared, the small lamp casting a soft glow across the surface. And then he saw it, not immediately, not as something obvious, but as something slightly misplaced, a chair that was not aligned with the desk, angled just enough to suggest it had been moved recently. His gaze shifted to the edge of the desk where a glass of water sat, untouched, but not settled, the faint ripple on its surface betraying a disturbance that had occurred moments ago. He stepped further inside, his movements slow, deliberate, each step calculated to avoid unnecessary sound. And as he moved, the pattern became clearer. This room had been occupied, recently, carefully, and then vacated in a hurry that had tried to disguise itself as order. His eyes lowered slightly, catching a detail near the base of the desk, a faint mark against the otherwise flawless floor. Not damage, not something that would draw attention, but enough to indicate pressure, movement, something placed where it should not have been. And then removed, he straightened, his expression unchanged, but his mind already reconstructing what had happened, not with certainty, but with direction, the kind that narrowed possibilities instead of expanding them. He turned his head slightly toward the hallway, listening again, and this time the silence answered differently, not empty, but restrained, as if the house itself was holding something back. He stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him with the same quiet precision. And as he moved back into the main space, his gaze found the corner where the security panel was mounted, its display steady, flawless, reflecting nothing but compliance. And yet he knew better now, because perfection did not erase truth, it concealed it. And the more perfect the system appeared, the more carefully the truth had been hidden beneath it. His hand slipped in his pocket once more, not to check the system again, but to send a single, silent instruction that would not trigger alerts, would not disrupt the surface, but would begin to peel back the layers that had been constructed without his knowledge. Behind him, the hallway remained quiet. Emily nowhere in sight, and yet her presence lingered in every detail he had observed, not as the cause, but as the signal, the one variable that did not belong to the pattern. And as he stood there, still and composed, Kang Jae-min understood something with growing clarity. Whatever had happened in that room was not an isolated moment. It was part of something larger, something that had been unfolding in the spaces he trusted most. And the truth, whatever it was, had already begun to surface, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The message was sent without a sound, a single instruction buried deep within the system, subtle enough to avoid detection, yet precise enough to begin unraveling what had been carefully concealed. And Kang Jae-min did not move after sending it, his posture unchanged, his expression as controlled as ever, but his awareness sharpened, expanding beyond what could be seen into what could be inferred. Because this was no longer about a single room or a single inconsistency. It was about a pattern that had learned how to hide, and patterns like that required patience to expose. He walked slowly toward the main living area, his footsteps measured, each one echoing faintly against the polished floor, the space around him immaculate, untouched, presenting the illusion of order that had been maintained for years without question, and yet now every detail carried weight, every silence held meaning. He paused near the large window that overlooked the quiet Seoul skyline, the city lights, stretching endlessly into the distance, cold and distant, a reminder that even in a place designed for control, there were forces that moved beyond it. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, composed, unyielding, but behind that stillness, calculations were already unfolding, timelines reconstructing themselves, access logs aligning with physical movement, human behavior intersecting with digital traces, and at the center of it all, one constant remained: Emily Carter, not as the cause, but as the one point where the system's perfection had faltered. He turned away from the window, his gaze shifting toward the corridor that led deeper into the house, and without hesitation, he moved, not toward the obvious spaces, but toward the ones that rarely drew attention, the areas where routine masked irregularity, his hand brushing lightly against the wall as he walked, not for support, but for contact, a subtle way of grounding himself in the physical reality of a place that now felt layered with something unseen. He stopped near a secondary access panel, smaller, less prominent than the main control system, designed for maintenance rather than oversight, his fingers moving with quiet precision as he activated it. The screen lighting up instantly, revealing a simplified interface that most would overlook, but he knew better because systems were never truly isolated. They overlapped, intersected, and where they did, gaps could form, gaps that allowed things to pass unnoticed. His eyes scanned the data quickly, not reading every line, but recognizing patterns, the absence of expected fluctuations, the consistency that should not have existed. And then he saw it, not a missing entry, but a repeated one, a block of time duplicated across multiple days, identical down to the second, a perfect copy that replaced what should have been variable, human, unpredictable. His gaze narrowed slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, because this was not an error. It was an overwrite, a deliberate masking of real activity. And as he stood there, the quiet hum of the system filling the space, he understood the scale of what he was looking at. This was not a single incident, not a momentary lapse. It was a sustained alteration, something that had been maintained over time, carefully enough to avoid detection, but not perfectly enough to escape it entirely. He deactivated the panel without leaving a trace of access, his movements as controlled as when he began, and as he stepped back into the corridor, his attention shifted once more, this time not to the system, but to the human element within it. Because data could be altered, systems could be manipulated, but behavior, real behavior, always left something behind. And as he moved through the house, his steps silent, his presence almost imperceptible. He listened again, not for sound, but for absence, for the subtle distortions that revealed tension. And somewhere ahead, beyond the next turn, he sensed it. Not movement, not noise, but the same restrained stillness he had felt before, the kind that did not belong to an empty space. And as Kang Jae-min slowed his pace, his gaze fixed forward, one thought settled into certainty. Whatever truth had been hidden inside this safe house, it was no longer contained. It was waiting just beyond the surface, and he was already close enough to touch it. He did not rush the final steps, because truth revealed too quickly often shattered before it could be understood. And Kang Jae-min had never been a man who acted without seeing the full shape of what he faced, his pace slowing as he approached the turn in the corridor. The air subtly different here, heavier, as if something had settled into the space and refused to move, the lighting softer, shadows stretching longer along the walls. And in that quiet distortion, he sensed it again, not movement, not sound, but presence, restrained and carefully held back. He stopped just before the corner, not out of hesitation, but calculation, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if he were stepping into a conversation that had already begun without him. And when he turned, he saw her, Emily Carter, standing near the far wall, her posture straight but rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding herself together by force alone. She had not expected him here, not this. Deep into the house, not at this moment. And for a brief second, something unguarded flickered across her face before it disappeared beneath the same controlled expression she had worn since the beginning. "You should be resting," he said, his voice calm, neutral, but it carried a weight that made the words feel less like a suggestion and more like a boundary being tested. Emily lowered her gaze immediately. "I finished my task, sir," she replied, her voice steady, but there was a tightness. Beneath it, something held back, something that had learned to remain unseen. Jamin took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to shift the distance between them. And in that small adjustment, he watched her reaction, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed together more firmly, subtle signs that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him. "Who assigned your additional hours?" he asked, his tone unchanged. The question simple on the surface, but precise in its intent. Emily hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "The night's supervisor, sir," she answered, and though the words were correct, they lacked something, certainty. Jimin held her gaze for a moment longer, not forcing eye contact, but waiting, allowing the silence to expand, because silence had a way of revealing what words concealed, and in that space, Emily's breathing shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if she were weighing something. Not what to say, but whether to say anything at all. "You do not need to work beyond your assigned hours," he said finally, his voice quieter now, not softer, but more focused. And for the first time, she looked up just slightly, her eyes meeting his for less than a second before dropping again. "I understand, sir," she replied, but the response came too quickly, too rehearsed. And that was when the final piece aligned. Not a single event, not a single person, but a system of behavior, one that conditioned silence, one that taught compliance beyond instruction, one that made someone like Emily Carter believe that enduring, without question, was the safest choice. Jamin straightened slightly, his expression returning to its usual stillness, but the decision had already been made, not spoken, not announced, but set into motion with the same quiet certainty that defined everything he did. "You may go," he said. And this time, there was no hesitation. Emily nodded, stepping back carefully before turning and walking down the corridor, her pace controlled, her posture unchanged. But something in the way she moved suggested a release, small, almost invisible, as if the weight she carried had shifted, if only slightly. Jamin remained where he was, watching until she disappeared from view. And when the corridor fell silent again, he did not move immediately, because he no longer needed to search, he no longer needed to question. The truth was no longer hidden in fragments. It had taken shape, clear and undeniable, not as an isolated incident, but as something that had been allowed to exist within his own walls. And as he finally turned, his footsteps echoing softly as he walked back toward the center of the house. One thought settled with absolute clarity. This was not just about what had happened. It was about what had been tolerated, and that was something he would not allow to continue. The house did not change overnight, at least not in any way that could be seen. The marble floors still gleamed under soft lighting. The air remained perfectly balanced at 72 degrees, and every surface reflected the same quiet luxury it always had. But something beneath that surface had shifted, something invisible yet undeniable, and Kang Jae-min stood at the center of it without announcing his presence, without raising his voice, because control did not require noise, it required precision. And over the next 72 hours, precision became the only language that mattered. Schedules adjusted without explanation, staff rotations reassigned with no room for negotiation, access privileges recalibrated in ways that felt routine to anyone who did not know better. And yet every change moved with a purpose, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. The kind of movement that did not disrupt the surface, but reshaped everything beneath it. Emily Carter noticed it first not through instruction, but through absence. The night supervisor who had once lingered too long in the corridors was no longer there. His presence removed so completely, it was as if he had never existed within those walls. Conversations that once stopped when she entered no longer happened at all, replaced by a silence that felt different, not tense, not watchful, but clean, and for the first time since she arrived. The air in the safe house did not press against her chest when she breathed. She still moved carefully, still kept her eyes lowered, because habits like hers did not disappear in a day. But something inside her had begun to loosen, a small shift, almost unnoticeable, like the first inch of space in a room that had always been too tight. Jimin observed all of this without interference, his presence moving through the house at irregular intervals. Never predictable, never announced, but always felt, and where he went, the subtle adjustments followed. Doors that had once been closed at certain hours remained open. Cameras that had faltered even for a fraction of a second now operated without delay, every detail aligning. Not with artificial perfection, but with true consistency, the kind that did not need to be forced. And still, he said nothing, not to the staff, not to Emily, not even to the inner circle that would have questioned the quiet restructuring if they had been aware of it, because this was not about explanation. It was about correction, and correction, when done properly, did not leave room for resistance. On the fourth morning, Emily stood in the main living area, arranging the last of the fresh linens, her movements steady, her breathing even. And for a moment, she allowed herself to pause, just for a second, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table as she looked out toward the large windows, the city beyond stretching wide and distant. And it was in that small, unguarded moment that she felt it. Not fear, not pressure, but something unfamiliar, something she had not allowed herself to recognize before. Safety, not complete, not yet, but present enough to be felt. And when she turned, she saw him, Kang Jae-min, standing near the entrance, his posture unchanged, his expression as controlled as ever, but the space around him no longer carried the same weight it once had. It was quieter now, not because of silence, but because something had been removed from it, something that no longer belonged. Their eyes met for a brief second, not long enough to challenge, not long enough to question, but long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Acknowledgement, not of what had happened, but of what had changed. Emily lowered her gaze again, returning to her work, her movements calm, no longer rushed, no longer driven by the same invisible urgency. And Jae-min remained where he was for a moment longer before turning away, his steps quiet as he moved back into the deeper corridors of the house, leaving behind a space that no longer needed to hold its breath. Because whatever had been hidden within those walls had been seen, and without a single word, it had been answered. The house breathed differently now, not because anything visible had changed, but because something unseen had been lifted from its walls. And in that quiet transformation, Kang Jae-min stood once more at the edge of the main room, his presence as controlled as ever, yet no longer carrying the same cold distance. It once did, The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a softer glow across the marble surfaces, no longer reflecting tension, but something steadier, something grounded, and Emily Carter moved through that light with a rhythm that had begun to change, her steps still careful, her posture still composed, but no longer tightened by the invisible pressure that had once followed her through every corner of the house. She paused briefly near the kitchen counter, adjusting a small detail that did not need adjusting, a habit she had not yet unlearned. And, as she did, she noticed something that made her stop, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. A small envelope placed neatly at the edge of the counter, positioned where it could not be missed, yet had not been there before. Her fingers hovered for a second before she reached for it, her movements slower than usual, as if she expected the simple act to carry consequences. But none came, only silence. Steady and unchanged, she opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. And for the first time since she arrived in Seoul, her expression shifted not from restraint, but from disbelief. Inside was a single sheet, clean, direct, informing her that her role had been formally reassigned, her hours adjusted to standard limits, her access expanded to areas that had once been restricted, and at the bottom, a line that stood apart from the rest, simple, unmistakable. Your position here is protected. She read it again, as if the words might change, as if they might disappear if she looked away. But they remained, steady and certain, and something inside her, something that had been held in place for far too long, loosened just enough to let her breathe without effort. She lowered the paper slowly, her gaze lifting toward the open space ahead, and there he was, Kang Jae-min, standing at a distance, not watching directly, not imposing, but present in a way that could not be ignored. Their eyes met again, longer this time, not with fear, not with obligation, but with a quiet recognition that required no explanation. He did not speak, did not gesture, because there was nothing left to command, nothing left to correct. The system had already been realigned, the imbalance removed, and what remained was not power displayed, but power restrained, the kind that chose not to dominate, but to restore. Emily held his gaze for a second longer before lowering it once more, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, a subtle shift that changed everything without needing to announce it. She folded the paper carefully, placing it back on the counter before returning to her work, her movements now steady in a different way, no longer driven by fear, but by something quieter, something closer to peace. And Jae-min turned without another word, his footsteps carrying him back into the deeper parts of the house, his role complete not because he had acted loudly, but because he had acted precisely. And as the door behind him closed with a soft, final click, the space remained still, not with tension, but with balance, the kind that did not demand attention, the kind that simply existed. And in that silence, the truth no longer needed to hide, because it had already been seen. And without a single word spoken, dignity had been restored. And that day, the world remembered what it looks like.